Okay, welcome back. We're about to begin the lecture on value, and it'll probably be a two-parter. So in this unit, we've been talking about, we started with the art historical period of Mannerism to the Baroque, and that led to us further talking about painting, especially talking about oil painting. And, um, and now we're also going to be talking about value, because value is definitely a topic that comes up when you're discussing the Baroque a lot. But before we do that, there's just a little bit I left unsaid. One of the things I wanted to say about Pia Fries was how she, like the other two contemporary artists I was talking about, really kind of are pushing the boundaries of what is or isn't a painting. But also what I like about her is at the same time she's very much kind of building into that same language of that goes all the way back to Titian, where painting is defined as being about the mark and about the specific way that paint holds a mark and records a mark. But I think she, as well as Angela de la Cruz, very much kind of push the boundaries of what is or isn't a painting. Obviously, de la Cruz's work is very sculptural. They are, like stretched canvases that then are broken up and then arranged in kind of sculptural ways. And the person who I was very sad I couldn't show any of her images, I have no idea why the images did not load, is Katharina Gross. And I think that the way she makes painting become about installation and about space rather than about a flat object that you can call a painting. She does do some pieces that I believe that these large pieces here are actually stretched canvas. So she does some works that are kind of like a traditional idea of a painting, but those things are huge. But a lot of the work she does are very site-specific installations like this sort of piece, which I think is amazing, part of her Rockaway project. All right, so next we're going to talk about value, which is this lecture right here. Okay, so what is value? So remember when we started this course, I said that for every unit, I was going to talk about one design issue or design concept. And for many of these, those design issues, design concepts have been what are traditionally called the art element. So in the first unit, one of the art elements we discussed was line. We also talked about whether line and mark are the same thing or whether a mark should be considered an even more basic art element than line. But we talked about line. And then in unit 2, when we discussed figure ground, before we discussed figure ground, we had to start with talking about shape. In unit 3, talking about sculpture, led us to talk about form, not just form as in the big idea, but form as in the mass and the solid mass of an object, which you might call its positive volume. And so for each of these units, we've often touched upon an art element. Well, in this one, the art element is value. What is value? Well, value is basically the lightness or darkness of things. And so what I want you to consider is the different ways that value is created, and what we mean when we say something has a lot of value contrast, and the different kind of parts to value contrast, and as well as how value works in a picture, how value creates emphasis, and how value creates organization, a way of seeing how the whole composition is created. Value is one of these kind of interesting parts of art where it is a thing that where you, by focusing on contrast, you can create unity. Because by focusing on contrast, you generally then come up with kind of a unifying rule for how that contrast is organized. And that unifying rule then creates unity. So even as you're making things more different, making the darker areas darker and the lighter areas lighter, you're winding up creating a unified rule that holds the whole picture together. So let's talk about value. So value is a critical part, and contrast is a critical part, and value contrast. They're all critical parts of the Baroque, right? That the Baroque, partially because of Caravaggio, but also through many other artists, there was this emphasis on these kind of extreme forms of tenebrism and of like really, really dark and really using a lot of value contrast to organize how our eye sees a picture. Like one of the things you could say about this type of tenebrism is it automatically makes these areas of deep darkness less of a focus than the areas where things are clearly revealed by the light. So how do we make value contrast? Notice what I'm doing with my text, because I'm creating value contrast in two ways right there. So one way that we've already learned about is line weight, right? Just simply taking a mark and then making that mark thicker, right, will make it feel like it's a darker mark. If it's a dark mark on a light surface, like a pen line on a white piece of paper, if you make that pen line thicker, it's going to feel darker. It isn't actually darker, right? Because the value of that ink is exactly the same, but it feels darker, right? And it functions darker in the use of in an imagery. So also related to lines, repeating marks, right? Building up through hatching and cross hatching, right? Create and cross contour can create value and create kind of the impression of tone. But you could actually have real pure tone and pure gradation. You could have just absolute distinct values, right? The type is gray there and it's black there. But color also makes value as well, right? This particular blue is darker than that particular chartreuse green. So there's a value difference between the two. Okay, so let's go back to the earlier unit and talk about these two works of art again, and really pay attention to how the change of line weight, right, really creates value. Now, let me be clear, it's doing more than just creating value. The change of line weight is also creating rhythm, and the change of line weight is also creating emphasis. But right now, I just want you to focus on how it creates value and how, like, so this change of line weight right there really implies the way the hand is casting a shadow onto the leg, or how that there's a kind of a cast shadow caused by that crease between two parts of the leg pressing against each other. Whereas light lines, right, create the impression that there is light shining on that edge of the surface. So here are some examples of creating value through mark repetition, through taking lines or any kind of marks and repeating them over and over again, whether that's hatching and cross-hatching or cross-contour lines. It doesn't really matter what system. They all they vary. Those systems vary in terms of what kind of textures they make, but they all are the same in the fact that the more marks you load up in a particular area, the darker it's going to feel. And it's the same kind of issues like we were talking about with line weight. The actual value doesn't really change in that the black ink of the black line is always the same value, but that still feels like a much darker area there because it's so loaded up with dark marks. All right, so, and in this particular image, it's made entirely out of just repetition of marks. We're going to talk about this piece some more when we get to printmaking. And I should have, in one of my lectures, a close-up or a couple of close-ups of it, so you could really see how it's built up of these kind of cross-hatching and cross-contour type lines. Okay, sometimes through the repetition of marks, it really creates the illusion of tone. Once again, when we talk about printmaking, we'll talk about how this image here, which is it's a mezzotint, I think. No, well, I'm pretty sure it's an aquatint, but now I'm double guessing myself. Anyway, how it's creating tone out of little tiny marks, almost like little tiny dots. And this drawing right here, which looks like it's purely tonal, is actually made out of little hatching marks, hatching with white and hatching with charcoal. So a lot of the things that we think are purely tonal are still really just an extension of that same rule. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about value in the next part.